No parent should have to bury their child. It's one of the saddest things a mother or father could ever have to do. It's made even sadder when it never needed to happen. For those, like me, who have not had to do this, I simply cannot imagine the pain and feelings of loss that must come with this. To those who have, my heart goes out to them. When lives are taken from us, we mark these moments against the date they occur. They will never be forgotten, and we pray we will not have to face another that may hurt like these. How is it then a mother is forced to bury her son and made to face another day filled with just as much pain, frustration, anger, uncertainty, and a sheer lack of anything close to what could be considered just? And how could a single moment in time cause both of these dates for this mother? We'll explore this on episode 3 of The Death of Jack Hanley.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Some dates are filled with unforgettable joy, others with sorrow and pain that can take the rest of a lifetime simply to learn to come to terms with. On December 29th, 2017, Julie Kelvin watches proceedings unfold as she buries her son, Jack Hanley in Whyalla, surrounded by family and friends. Attendees were asked to wear bright colours to honour Jack's memory. And although this date marks a celebration of young Jack's life, it's ultimately mixed with the pain of knowing that his life was needlessly taken by a single moment of unnecessary drunken violence and bravado-filled recklessness. Fast forward 18 months to July 1st, 2019, when Julie Kelvin is again a bystander to the events occurring around her. This time as the verdict is delivered in the manslaughter case against Reece Watherston. Reece was found not guilty of manslaughter, and the feelings of pain, frustration, anger, uncertainty, and a lack of anything just flood back once more. To unpack the verdict and fallout of this trial, I'm once again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster. Sean, as someone who was close to Julie Kelvin during this time, can you shed some insight into how Jack's mother managed through this?
Daniel, we've talked before about the poise, the grace, the tenacity that Julie Kelvin had shown throughout the trial process. But by the time of the verdict, it's fair to say that it had all fallen away. I don't think Julie's going to take any issue with me saying that by this point, she was a wreck.
Yeah.
She had visibly aged. She had a very grey pallor to her skin. She said to me numerous times that she felt like she was dead. One of the things that she would say was, "I wish I was with Jack."
So it was clearly obvious that this had taken its toll.
It had pretty much killed her.
Yeah.
She felt like she was the walking dead. She wasn't afraid to say that. She's got a beautiful daughter, beautiful other son, grandchildren. She felt like she couldn't be there for them. She felt like she was no longer a person in this world, a spectre moving through it, haunting her family rather than living with her family because of the limbo she'd been left in, waiting for that all-important verdict.
Absolutely. And, you know, we talk about someone's life is taken. The situation here is it's not just one life affected, though. One life taken, many lives affected. And we've started to discuss this and unpack it previously because, you know, on our last 2 episodes, we broke down the players and the lead up to the incident, as well as the trial process and, you know, and what evidence was tendered in this case. In this episode, we're going to discuss the verdict, its delivery and the fallout from these proceedings. And Sean, with that in mind, let's not waste time. Let's get to the verdict. What was this? How was this? I just want to unpack the nature of this verdict. Please, you were there, you heard it, you saw it, you were a part of that moment in time. Let us understand through you, what was this verdict all about?
It's interesting that you say, let's not waste time, because when it comes to a judge-alone trial, there's no time wasted. We've talked before about the large courtroom filled with one side people loyal to Jack Hanley, one side people loyal to Reece Watherston. The verdict was due to come in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Courts normally don't resume sitting until 2:15. So it's a very quiet period of time. 2 large groups of people move into this court, fill it up. Extra sheriff's officers are on duty just in case anything goes wrong. Passions are obviously able to be inflamed at this time. Incredibly tense atmosphere. Julie took the same seat just behind the journalists that she always took. I took the seat just in front of her. She actually reached out and squeezed my shoulder as I sat down, just to say that she was there. I turned around, I gave her a nod and a smile, and I said, "Good luck." What more can you say? Verdicts are delivered so quickly. The judge's associate walks in and says, "Please stand." Everyone stands up. The judge walks in, sits down. You all sit down. Justice Ann Bampston looks and says, "For the reasons I now publish, I find the defendant not guilty. Adjourn the court."
Hang on. So you're telling me... So what span of time are we talking from the time of everyone sort of comes in? And I should say, there are 2 parties here, as you said, and I think that's a really interesting point. There are 2 young men's lives here that we are discussing and unpacking. One is Jack, and we know Jack is deceased. One is Reece, who still potentially has years, many years, whatever that might look like, to live out, dependent upon, and it's going to take very different paths dependent on this very moment. So I'm incredulous here as to understand. Talk me through, what is that time frame from everyone coming into that courtroom, all rise, being seated, and that being delivered?
Exactly the time it took me to tell you.
That's
real time.
That is outstanding, Sean. I know me personally probably wouldn't have expected that, and I'm pretty sure there's a number of listeners right now going, "How could that be for such, such an elaborate case with so many elements to it that's over as quick as that?"
Because it's a judge-alone trial. So when a jury has to go away and come back with a verdict, they may deliberate for days on end.
Yep.
A judge finishes a trial on a particular date and then goes away to come back with their verdict. They've got other jobs to do, other cases to hear. So the parties are simply informed. Thursday of next week, come back to court, it's time for verdict. 2:00, everybody rolls in. The judge doesn't have to explain their verdict because they've written a written judgment. Now, the written judgment in the Watherston case runs 65 pages before you get to the footnotes, breaking down everything we've talked about over the past episodes of this show in absolute minutiae.
Yeah.
Every detail broken down. But that's a later consideration. All the judge has to do at that moment is say, "For the reasons I now publish," meaning the document, "I find the defendant," meaning Reece Watherston, "not guilty. Adjourn the court." And it's over.
And no one else has seen this document yet.
No one else has seen this document.
So no one gets to see that document until after the fact. So the judge can say, "For the reasons I publish," which I get that, understand. There's a 65-page, up to 65 pages before we get to the footnotes. Get that, but no one else has seen this. So It is literally a guilty, not guilty, and then go and read about it after the fact.
Exactly. You will find out later.
Wow.
So if you're Reece Watherston, in that moment, you've been acquitted of manslaughter. There is that massive swell of relief, of excitement, of newfound freedom, of guilt sloughing off your shoulders because you've been told by a court you did not kill someone. You are not criminally responsible for their death. You don't know why yet, but you don't really care at that moment.
Absolutely.
You've been told you're acquitted.
Yeah.
For Julie, I honestly thought she was going to drop dead on the spot. I honestly thought that. She was shaking to the point of convulsing. She was, when people cry and they don't actually realize they're crying, there's no conscious act of tears, it's just tears streaming.
Yeah.
I turned around and I honestly thought Julie's face was in shadow. Right. It was so dark under her bangs. And, lovely, bright woman, but she looked like all the life had been drained out of her in that moment. Family and friends holding her up in the seat, trying to keep her upright, trying to keep her breathing, basically.
Yeah.
One half of the courtroom is in ecstasy.
Yeah.
That's the Watherston camp. And deservedly
and
so.
That's what they
wanted.
That was
But the other half's in agony.
Yeah.
And you have agony and ecstasy separated by a gap no further than a meter, because the gap between the two groups is the meter pathway between the two sets of seats.
Absolutely.
That is just an almost indescribable tension, feeling, euphoria, grief. And as a journalist, you're in the middle of all of that. You know, you are caught up in that swell. I'm at the point now after 20 years of doing this that when I know it's going to be a trial by judge alone, I don't even take out my notebook to write down the verdict. Because the time it takes me to write down what the judge has said, close my notebook and stand back up, I'll have missed 50 other things that have happened. I'll have missed Reece walking from the dock straight into the arms of his father, who wrapped him up in one of the most emotional and visceral hugs I've ever seen. Like footballers after a grand final, that big, euphoric, wrapping around each other, manly hug. Yeah. Greeted him with that. His mum coming over, crying, throwing herself over them. His mates not cheering, but you could see on their faces the excitement. They all kept their composure. I've covered cases where defendants' families have behaved in absolutely execrable manner. They've whooped, they've cheered, they've clapped, no decorum whatsoever. The Watherston camp didn't do that. They were very excited.
To their credit.
Very relieved. And yes, to their credit, they handled themselves with decorum.
Sure.
And then they got the heck out of that courtroom as quickly as they could.
Understandable.
Julie's camp, the Kelbins, the Hanleys, that family, they waited for the prosecutor, Mark Norman. Because at that point, Mark Norman is sitting there at the bar table, madly leafing through those 65 pages to try to get some sense of what he needs to tell this grieving family.
Of course.
And we as journalists, we're running straight to the media room saying to the person that operates that, we need a copy of this judgment.
Absolutely.
There are some judges who, when they know a judgment is going to be controversial or particularly well read, they'll have copies ready for the media. In this case, Justice Bampton did have copies ready.
Okay.
And so they were waiting for us. And so you've got journalists standing around the Sir Samuel Way building on any flat surface they can, leafing through, tweeting, writing down, trying to inform camera crews outside what's going on. Because here's the other thing. What's going to happen now? All these emotions are raw. Nobody really knows what's happened and why.
Yeah.
Who's going to react first? Who's feeling froggy? Who's going to jump? Is anybody going to do something stupid?
Sean, we're going to touch on that because we are going to have a look at this verdict and we're going to have a look at this fallout. And I know there's plenty to unpack in that. There's plenty to flesh out. I know some of the response that came from that. I can't wait to unpack that further. Sean, I mentioned that we're going to unpack this, and this is the part that, you know, knowing as much as I do so far, and I'm truly interested and intrigued to understand how this looks, feels, and the actual, I guess, terminology and the way this is put together. You talked about a verdict being delivered by Justice Bampton being around about 65 pages long before getting to some footnotes, etc. So, and as you would expect, it's going to have to be long, lengthy, detailed, have all of that into it. But this is the part I think that we're all waiting to understand. We've talked about how this incident occurred, and we got to a point, and we started this very series about Jake Hanley talking about how can all of this occur where a punch is thrown, a life is lost, this video footage, all of these things, and yet no one is held criminally responsible for the act. This document essentially is I guess that's the tutorial of how this occurs, right?
It absolutely is. And I'm going to encourage everybody out there, after you listen to this episode, go online and Google a website called Austli, Austli. It's an educational website that contains every piece of legislation in the country and every judgment of every court in the country. It's a phenomenal resource. Go to Austli, type in the word Watherston. The first link that comes up will be Justice Bampton's 65-page plus footnotes judgment about this case. So
our audience can go on and they can go and research and read this for themselves?
Everybody can read it for themselves. You can check the bona fides of what we've told you. It's all there for you to read. But here's something interesting, Daniel. This is the job of a court reporter.
Yeah.
My job is to listen to, or read in this case, something incredibly legally complex and then boilerplate it down to something that everybody can understand. I mean no disrespect by that. I'm not saying that people out there are incapable.
No.
I'm saying I'm making it digestible.
Yeah, look, I agree, Sean. I've seen some of the documentation and, you know, as the term is, legalese, you know, it's out there. It's almost a language unto itself that if you're not involved and embedded in that is incredibly difficult at times to make head nor tail of. So, look, as you said, it's the life of a journalist and it's what you do. So
let me read you this one paragraph.
Sure.
This is paragraph 477 out of 487 paragraphs in this judgment. I'm just going to read it as it is. We'll unpick it later. The reasonable possibility that Mr. Watherston genuinely believed that his conduct was necessary in self-defense has not been excluded. As such, it is necessary to objectively consider whether the force he used was reasonably proportionate. I have considered this issue, quotation marks, in a practical manner and without undue nicety, giving proper weight to the predicament of the accused, which may have afforded little, if any, opportunity for calm deliberation or detached reflection, close quote, footnote. In the vernacular, wrap your laughing gear around that. That is an incredibly dense paragraph. But let me tell you what it means to me with the benefit of 20 years of experience.
Yeah.
We started this by talking about the way the prosecution characterised the punch. An unlawful and dangerous act that was unnecessary.
Correct.
All possible force thrown behind this punch in circumstances where it was not warranted. We've talked about self-defense. We've talked about excessive self-defense. Talked about knife versus chair. We've had all those little examples.
Yeah.
And the reason I've given you all of those examples is because of a paragraph like this.
Yep.
The reasonable possibility, what is reasonable? What is reasonable doubt? That Mr. Watherston, the defendant, Reece, genuinely believed that his conduct was necessary in self-defense has not been excluded. Remember I told you, prosecution must prove their case beyond reasonable doubt. Defense doesn't have to prove anything. What she said there in the most legally complicated and yet important of terms is the prosecution has failed to prove something didn't happen.
Yeah.
Not that something did happen, something didn't. And that's the central tenement of this entire judgment. What the prosecution failed to disprove. The ultimate outcome of Justice Bampton's judgment is you've given me a painting of everything that happened, but you haven't made me understand that nothing but that painting can have happened. You've left me with questions. And worse, you've left me with questions in a trial by judge alone, where unlike a jury, I can sit and sift through the evidence again. I can watch that video backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards as many times as I like, because I'm a judge, not a jury, because Reece Watherston picked this. And while watching that video, Mr. Prosecutor, Madam Defence Counsel, I've found 2 frames that neither of you talked about. So by failing to disprove elements of the case, you've sent me looking for other information, and I've found it, and I've found 2 frames. And she says, in those 2 frames, which were not shown in court, not part of the video that I watched over and over again, not part of the video Julie Kelvin watched over and over again, Justice Bampton says 2 key frames appear to show Mr. Hanley punch toward a figure with blonde hair. Not definite.
Yeah.
Not even definite that the person he's punching to... Not definite that it's a punch, for starters. Not definite that it's toward Reece Watherston. But it could maybe, possibly, kind of, sort of look like Jack may be punching. And that's reasonable doubt. Because you've predicated your entire prosecution... I can see the look on your face. You've predicated your entire prosecution case on this punch was unnecessary. Jack did nothing and got punched for it. Jack ran away from the fight, copped it in the back of the head. There was no reason for Reece to do it, therefore it's manslaughter. But here's these 2 frames. And you didn't take time in the trial to explain those 2 frames to me. Because you didn't take time to explain those 2 frames to me, I'm left with reasonable doubt. Why am I left with reasonable doubt? Because of the 2 frames. Why did I see the 2 frames? Because you didn't answer the other questions. You have failed to disprove the reasonable possibility that it might have been self-defense.
You mentioned that you saw the look on my face, Sean. The only thing that is running through my head at the moment is, and look, I'll be honest, I'm a pretty simple kind of guy. I need to simplify things down to their base level just so I can understand them. And generally, if I do it to that level where I can understand it, most other people can. What I am hearing there is ambiguity was not removed.
Yes.
Therefore, I can't have any certainty.
Yes.
And therefore, I can't, with any real ability to go, definitely this occurred, acquitted.
And you've just summed up the legal system right there.
As I said, I need to make it as simple as possible. And from everything you've just said, and I thank you for being able to translate that from that legal type to something that we can digest as the general public. And for me, all I'm hearing from that is you left ambiguity on the table.
Yeah.
You didn't remove the possibility for me to go, there's no other option. We can't have that because of reasonable doubt.
Here's Justice Bampton's description of those frames. Mr. Hanley's back is to the camera. We're talking about, again, the camera, the mobile phone footage taken from the dash cam from across the intersection where the noise of the head hitting the ground was so loud it was still audible. Mr. Hanley's back is to the camera, and he appears to be thrusting his body forward and thrusting his right arm over in a punching motion toward the figure with blonde hair and a black top, whom I suspect is Mr. Watherston. He appears to be thrusting his body forward and throwing a punch at Mr. Watherston, who is near the green signal box. Therefore, it is arguable that caused Mr. Watherston to retreat and then return to deliver the fatal punch. It cannot be excluded that Mr. Hanley, consistent with Mr. Watherston's evidence, was acting aggressively. The reasonable possibility that Mr. Watherston defended himself in response to the charging by Mr. Hanley by engaging in what has been described as haymaker punches has not been excluded. The reasonable possibility that Mr. Watherston genuinely believed that his conduct was necessary in self-defense has not been excluded. I want to make this very clear. Justice Bampton is not saying, I believe Reece Watherston. She's saying, you have failed to disprove Reece Watherston's evidence. As a prosecutor, you have not removed the possibility that he's telling me the truth. And Daniel's rolling his eyes now enough that they're going to stick at the roof of his skull.
Look, this point right here, in this moment of what we've just heard and the inability, if you like, for the prosecution to remove that, the defense not having to prove it, Justice Bampton doing the right thing in terms of the confines of which she predicates over. We are talking right now about the premise of exactly why you and I sit in the studio and we decided to run this show, because what we're talking about is legally 100% on the money. That is legally, from a lawful perspective, correct. What you and I as human beings who feel, etc., are now, the reason my eyes are rolling is this just? And look, for one side of that courtroom that you talked about in Ecstasy, they're probably going, yes, it is just because it was proven.
For a lot of defense lawyers out there, legal academics, this is catnip. This is exactly the way the system is supposed to work.
Absolutely. From a lawful perspective, and I get that. I guess the part that's always going to be up for debate there is, where is the piece that is just in this? Because there's one half of that courtroom that's going, even if I can concede to the point of it being lawful, there is no way in hell that this could ever be considered to be just.
And especially not when the judgment contains this. This is another line from the judgment. And this is where people say, the colloquialism, it doesn't pass the sniff test, it doesn't pass the pub test. Listen to this. This is again from Justice Bampton. There is no dispute that Mr. Watherston delivered the single punch to Mr. Hanley's face, causing him to fall backwards and sustain the blunt head trauma that caused his death. He definitely threw the fatal punch. Having regard to the whole of the evidence and submissions of counsel, the prosecution has not satisfied me beyond reasonable doubt that I should reject Mr. Watherston's evidence as a reasonably possible version of the facts. The prosecution has not excluded the reasonable possibility that he fought back because he believed he had to, and that the belief was reasonable and genuine, and that his conduct was proportional to the threat he perceived. Jack was a big guy. I had to throw a punch with all my force, Reece said in the witness box. So, breaking this down, out of legalese into common talk, Reece Watherston threw a killer punch. But he is not criminally responsible for throwing that killer punch because there remains a question mark over whether he genuinely believed he needed to throw a killer punch.
And that is a piece we're going to have to unpack a little bit further, because for me, again, what may be lawful here certainly doesn't feel just at this time. Sean, I just want to recap for a second, because we just made a statement there. We just talked about There's a document here, a legal document, a verdict on a case of manslaughter here, where we've got a verdict saying a man threw a killer punch, yet is not recognised for being responsible for killing another man.
Yeah, you can throw a killer punch and not be a killer.
Talk to me. How is that? How does that like that? Just seems. It seems unfeasible, untenable to be able to understand.
Counterintuitive, stupid, dumb. Look, I've heard everything when it comes to this case in terms of reactions, because it is that difference between what is lawful and what is just, what is common tongue, what is legalese. The act of throwing the punch is a act that is seen to have caused a death.
Yes.
But you have to separate that from the intent behind it, any potential justifications, and that therefore means that the arm behind that punch does not belong to a killer.
And the pieces around that, which, as we said before, muddy the waters, is that ambiguity that we couldn't remove that reasonable doubt because, you know, whether we want to put that to the prosecution's case or the defense case or so good or whatever that looked like, there were pieces here that couldn't be removed to say this definitely happened in this manner, and therefore Justice Bamden has gone, as you said, and looked at the extra evidence to understand this as best as she could and said, look, I've come across these little pieces here which mean I can't 100% definitely say that I am convinced this was done for this reason.
You said at the very first episode of this series, this is the death of Jack Hanley.
Yeah.
It's definitely not the murder of Jack Hanley. Nobody was charged with murder. It's not the manslaughter of Jack Hanley because there was an acquittal. There was a not guilty verdict.
Yep.
We can't even say the killing of Jack Hanley because you have to have somebody who did the killing in order for there to be a killing. It's now a death.
Yeah.
It is a one-punch death. Is Reece Watherston the person that threw the punch? Undoubtedly. The judgment says that.
Yes.
But then the legal comes in after that moment of impact. This is why our legal system never finds somebody innocent.
Yes.
Because innocence means nothing wrong was ever done. And this judgment does not say that. It doesn't say Reece did nothing wrong.
Yep.
It says the judge can't be sure Reece did something wrong. And because she can't be sure, he has to go free. Yeah. Because you can only have people in jail who we know have done the wrong thing.
And that is why we have acquitted and not innocent.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Why the verdict is guilty or not guilty. Yeah. Never innocent. Nobody is ever found innocent.
Yeah, it's a funny thing when you said that. You and I have discussed that before off air, and it's like, yeah, when you break that down, yeah, okay, that makes sense. You are charged with something. You are either found guilty or you're acquitted of it and found not guilty of it, but no one's ever found innocent. That's not a term that's ever used in that sense. So,
that's right.
So we have a really tragic incident. We know we have a death that's occurred. We have someone who is responsible for throwing a punch which has caused this death. We also have a verdict here, a justification saying that that person who threw that punch is not found responsible for the death in that sense. So there's going to be, and we know there was, fallout from this. We know that this was taken a number of ways. And before I get into, before we talk about the emotional piece, I guess, is one area we're going to lean into shortly. I want to talk about the legal piece of this and what was the fallout from, you know, the legal fraternity, maybe the justice fraternity. What was the fallout from a legal perspective after the fact? What happened next?
If you don't like a verdict, you file an appeal. Whether you're prosecution, whether you're defense, challenge it to the Court of Criminal Appeal. Say that it needs to be overturned. Say that you need a retrial. Say that the verdict was unsafe and unsatisfactory. If you're the DPP, and anybody can go online and look at this, we're going to give you a fair bit of homework in this series. Go online and look up the Director of Public Prosecutions of South Australia's Charter. It talks about what their duties are, what their responsibilities are, when they will and won't act. They have the obligation to file an appeal when it is in the public interest or when a verdict brings justice into disrepute in the minds of the community.
Sean, I would say that in this situation, that seems incredibly reasonable in this case that we would want this challenged by the DPP.
Incredibly reasonable. Absolutely right. So tell me why they didn't.
I'd love to, Sean, but that's why I've got you here.
It's
because that's the part that gets me, because I didn't want to bring that up, but I know that there was no appeal actually put in for this. I know that they had talked about it. It was spoken. The DPP had actually commented on this. And my understanding was that that was always the intent. So why didn't it happen, Sean?
I wish I could tell you. Your guess is as good as mine. But the DPP, after several days of questioning from myself, from other journalists, came back and simply said, we're not going to challenge this.
So you got no better explanation after you said you questioned this, challenged, why aren't you putting this in? You got no better explanation than that from the DPP.
Not from the DPP. What I know about this comes from Julie Kelvin.
Okay.
And what Julie told me was that the DPP thought they had no reasonable prospect of success. Now, I don't want to attach any empathy to a public servant here, but think about what we've talked about for the past couple of episodes. Go back to Prosecutor Mark Norman. An unnecessary punch, all force, thrown for no reason in unlawful circumstances. Now compare that to Her Honour's judgment. How can you possibly resolve that difference? You would have to win a retrial.
Okay.
You'd have to run the entire trial again.
Yeah.
And you'd have to make sure that you had an answer for those 2 frames of footage that you didn't have an answer for the first time. But you've got to convince 3 justices of the Supreme Court to give you that second chance. The DPP did not feel they could mount a compelling enough argument to get a second bite of the cherry.
It's really interesting. You know, Adelaide's not that big a city, and you know we know that Victoria Square has Supreme Court, etc., that sits there, and you know it's minutes away. A walk is our Adelaide Casino, and you're just taking a punt and having a gamble there, really, aren't you, Sean? Because I don't know, do you have better odds on the pokies down at the casino, or do you have better odds trying to get 3 justices to actually agree that there is something better at stake here that we need to investigate?
If you're a member of the prosecution authorities, you got a better chance at the casino, because prosecutorial authority, you got a better chance at the casino because prosecution appeals seldom get up. Very, very rare. It's a high bar to jump to say that you are challenging because there is a legitimate public interest in overturning one of their brother judges. And I don't mean to be genderist there. That's what they call them, brother judges. And I'm not saying that it's a boys' club or a girls' club or a boys and girls' club and they look after each other and they're cliquey and they don't want to overturn each other. They're like any workplace. They'll happily backbite one another and point out each other's flaws. Yeah. But to say that justice has been done wrong, that a judge was wrong, that's a high bar to try to jump. You want to have all your chambers loaded if you're going to argue that.
For sure. And you would want to think that, you know, just like any other profession, that the person that has been appointed to that situation to make that call knows their stuff, knows what they're talking about in Justice Bantham's case, to go, no, look, we think Justice Bantam has ticked the boxes, you know, dotted the I's, crossed the T's, has done the diligence that is required of that appointed position. Yeah, that's going to be tough to then ask 3 other justices to go back and go, actually, one of your fraternity isn't up to scratch.
And look, I've read that judgment backwards, forwards, up and down.
Yeah.
I see it as cast iron. To this day, I don't agree with it. Oh, sorry, that's not true. I do agree with it.
Yes,
legally, I 100% agree with it. She's right, legally. Morally, I don't agree with it.
Yeah.
I'm fairly certain Justice Bampton doesn't morally agree with it either, but that's not her job.
And that's
like we said, this is a court of law, not a court of morals.
I was going to say, Justice Bantam's morality is not on trial here.
Whatsoever. Not at all. Nor is the effectiveness or efficaciousness of the prosecution. We're not saying they did anything wrong either.
Absolutely not, no. And I think that's probably a really good point to make. As prickly and as, obtuse as you and I can choose to be at times, we are not saying that Justice Bantam has actually done anything incorrect here.
Not at all.
It is just the cornerstone that the discussions that you and I had that built this. It is absolutely lawful. We just don't believe it's just.
And this is something that people out there that are going to take umbrance with this program are going to have to get used to. We're not here to criticize the outcome. We're here to analyze the outcome. It is legally sound. We're not saying anything other than that. Doesn't mean we like it. Doesn't mean that on a personal level we agree with it. Academically, of course we agree.
Yeah.
But personally, we don't have to agree. This is the difference between Sean as court reporter Monday to Friday and Sean doing this show. This is where I can say, I really don't like this.
Yeah. So if you're listening and you do want, if you want to hear what it sounds like when Sean gets needled and actually is able to say what he truly thinks, that's what I'm here for. So It is one of those things, Sean. You and I have talked to this. As much as we can agree with the verdict and the way it's been written, etc., it's such a hard pill to swallow. And, it's something that, you and I are taking a little bit of the mickey of this at the moment. We still have to come back to that somber respect that this is someone's life that is hanging here. 2 lives, actually. One that was taken and one that's going to be altered one pathway or another, as I said before, upon this verdict. And it's not just as easy as, yes, no, this happened, this didn't happen, that's how it is. There are so many elements, and this case alone has so many of those murky little pieces of the minutiae that you talked about, which really sway this. And as you said, we're talking about 2 frames of a video that wasn't even included in the original case at that point, which has truly been the crux of what this all comes down to. How is it possible that after everything you and I have talked about in 2.5 episodes so far, comes down to 2 frames of video footage that doesn't prove anything?
Literally does not prove anything.
Just proves that we haven't disproved anything.
Double negatives.
Let that sink in. 2 frames that doesn't prove anything just proves that we haven't proved anything. Again, this is why you and I talked about this for such a long time, wanted to do this. I do want to bring this back, and the next thing we're going to talk about is, we've talked about the legal aspect of this and what the legal fallout here was. There's another element to this, and this is the part where, in a moment, I'm going to come down. I'm actually going to read the initial response, the initial emotional response of Julie Kelburn directly after this verdict was handed down. She left the courthouse and gave what was a pretty emotional response to the media waiting. Sean, I said we're going to have a look at the emotional fallout of this for a grieving mother, and I'm going to read the statement here of Julie Kelburn as she left court. I'm going to lead with the line, "Isn't my son's life worth more?" While I visit a cemetery to sit at my son Jack's grave, Watherston gets to live his life freely. Where is the justice for my son Jack, who had never had a violent fight in his life? How many more deaths on our street is it going to take before our legal system starts to take this seriously? This judge has just said, go and live your happy life while this mother lives in misery. How can a person kill another person with one punch, just receive a effing not guilty? Isn't my son's life worth more than this? Myself and my family have had to live without this missing link. I'll never get to see my son marry and have his own children. I have been robbed. I've lived 568 days of hell without my youngest son, Jack. I know the offender didn't intend to kill my son, but he did. Where is the justice? Every weekend someone is hurt in this city. When are we going to step up? Strong, emotional, hard words to hear. Sean, I'm reading those words off a page and I'm feeling, just from my own interpretation, you were there. You saw Julie stand there and deliver this statement. Help myself and our listeners understand what was that emotion, what was that delivery like from Julie, and what was your take having to see this grieving mother do that?
Have you ever heard a truly distraught person speak? There's almost an echo in their speech because of the depths of their sorrow. That was Julie in that moment. It was spoken with tears. It was spoken with a pleading tone. This was a woman that was pleading for answers, pleading for meaning, pleading for a reason to go on. Imagine how much that verdict exacerbates those kind of feelings, those absolutely traumatic, life-destroying, soul-crushing feelings. I'm standing around Julie as part of a semicircle of the media, cameras and microphones in her face. Not a nice situation for anybody. Julie handled it as best she could, but she wept and she wept and she wept. And when she finished that statement, she fell into the arms of her other son and just continued to cry. Right there, it's a sunny day, it's 2:20 in the afternoon, and this woman's world has been crushed for a second time. The Watherstons leave during this time, go past. Reece is arm locked with his father, with someone that I'm assuming was a brother or a friend, walked around the corner into the Central Markets. One of our photographers got a photo of Reece kissing his father on the top of the head. That very sort of football-like kiss. And I'm not trying to say that they were celebrating or anything like that, just to give you that mental picture, that boys after the game feel, that blokey affection, caring for one another. Big kiss on the head as he walks around the corner. And in their wake is Julie. And I think we were there for an hour. I remember her sitting down, leaning on the pillars, just shaking her head the whole time.
The word that comes to mind for me, Sean, is devastated. You said around about 2:20 in the afternoon. Now, we know that the court was called back at 2 o'clock. So for a span of 20 minutes, we go into a court, we write, we stand up, we sit down, we hear a statement, we're ushered outside. We're giving this statement now to a waiting throng of media. Sean, as devastating, as tragic, as gut-wrenching as you've told us, and this, I've only read the words, but your reenactment or retelling of the story of what Julie was like, and is truly hard to listen to and take. I want to change this a little bit and shift gears, because I know that shortly after this statement's given, something remarkable happens.
This is a moment that will live with me forever. Roughly the same time, an appeal judgment was being handed down in the case of Vivian Deboo. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Vivian Deboo is an infamous child sex predator, a pedophile, who destroyed the lives of many children over the years, but has been convicted of 2 very famous cases. You know them, I know them, and the listeners know them as the Masked Brothers. Mm-hmm. 2 men who decided to embody the facelessness of child sex victims by putting on blank, white-faced masks, staging peaceful protests outside of court, speaking publicly, eloquently, passionately about the plight of child sex abuse survivors. Deboo had challenged his prison term. The Court of Criminal Appeal, at 2:15 that day, handed down a judgment saying, no dice, do your time. So the brothers came out of court ecstatic, euphoric. After all these years, they had a victory.
Yeah.
I was covering both cases at the same time. So after Julie had given her statement, I'd made a beeline to see the Masked Brothers as they came out, clapping, cheering, thrilled. They hugged me. They gave me a round of applause for my role in their case, which was just something I was having trouble processing.
Talk about running the gamut of emotions from one moment to another in this sense, and that's just yourself and your role, as opposed to these individuals having to actually run through their own situations.
That's right, like being stuck between stations. A minute ago, I'm like trying to console Julie and trying to keep her standing alongside her family. The next minute, the brothers are clapping me on the back and asking their supporters to give me a round of applause for supporting them. I couldn't really process that. I would have loved to have enjoyed that moment, enjoyed their happiness with them, but I was also trying to keep one eye on Julie at the same time. The brothers looked at me and they said, Sean, what's wrong? And I explained what had happened across the road. I'm getting chills remembering this. One of the brothers, who's known as A, takes his mask off, hands it to me, walks kitty corner across, reaches down to Julie, helps her up off the ground and says, my name is such and such. I've just heard what happened about you and your son. I am so sorry for your loss. Julie collapsed in his arms and started crying. A started crying as well. I'm standing there holding A's mask, and his brother, B, comes up to me and says, what's A doing? I explained. Off comes the mask. Hold this. He goes across there too. Here's 2 men whose innocence was robbed from them when they were but children. Deboo destroyed them to such an extent. People need to understand this. While Deboo was abusing them, he was telling them that their parents condoned this. So these men have built beautiful lives for themselves despite that abuse, have won justice, are in their moment of absolute supreme triumph, but it's all forgotten in a heartbeat because there's a woman across the road crying who needs comfort. Julie turns to these 2 men when she realizes who they are, and she says, what I've gone through is nothing compared to what you boys have gone through. As a mother to 2 boys, I am so sorry for your loss. And then all three of them are there, hugging each other, crying, consoling each other. Two with the ultimate victory, one with the ultimate loss. Not a single person took a photograph. Nobody filmed it, nothing, because we were all just awestruck by the humanity, by the empathy, by the beauty of that moment. And I firmly believe that that's the moment that Julie was able to turn the corner. Because those two men said to her, "We never gave up our fight. Don't give up yours."
For those men to show that care and empathy in that moment from their own position towards Julie is something phenomenal, which, you know, there's no good to come out of this, let's be honest. There's no good to come out of this, but if Julie can take anything out of this, it's that moment to know that humanity, empathy, and compassion still exist and live. What a beautiful piece to end that. These things don't always tie up in a neat little bow, Sean. However, our coverage of this case, of the death of Jack Hanley, technically ends at this moment here. But it doesn't end for those involved. We know that Jack, unfortunately, his life has ended. We also know that for those involved, such as Julie, the consequences, the repercussions, the feelings, the emotions, the memories, all of that does live on. We also know that there's a young man who has also gone on. And because of that, Sean, I want to ask you, when was the last time you saw Reece Watherston?
January 21st, 2021. Because I was sitting in the Adelaide Magistrates Court when he came in and unknowingly sat down next to me so that he could appear in court for 2 counts of property damage and 1 count of lying to a police officer about his identity.
You're telling me that even after all of this and an opportunity to keep your head down and take a different path, this potentially hasn't occurred?
Reece has been charged with having caused up to $2,500 property damage on the 28th of June 2020 at Darlington, and further property damage of the same amount on the 14th of November 2020 at Glenelg. And during that second incident, he allegedly provided false personal details to the officers who were investigating. That case, at time of recording, is ongoing.
As we said, and as you mentioned, Sean, those are alleged charges. And as we know, anything can happen when you go to trial. That is alleged. But I will leave our listeners with that, knowing at this stage where everything is. What I can tell you, though, is our intention is for next week to actually have a very special guest in the studio with us. We're actually going to speak to Julie Kelburn. We're going to have Jack's mother in the studio with us, and we're going to talk to her about her experience firsthand.
I am so honoured that Julie trusts us enough to come in and has given us her blessing to tell Jack's story to this point, and is now going to add her voice to this definitive recounting of this case.
Yeah. And with that, we thank you very much for coming along on this ride with us in the case of the death of Jack Hanley. We so look forward to you joining us next week when we do, as I said, speak to Julie Kelburn. But for now, thank you so much to 5AA. Thank you to all of our listeners, supporters, those who have contacted us and let us know what you've liked and how much you've appreciated what we do. We can't tell you how much we appreciate you listening to us. Your feedback is always valid, good, bad, or otherwise. We value all of it. If you want to catch up with us, you can, of course, find us on Just Lawful Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. Also at Just Lawful Pod on Twitter. Of course, keep up to date with the latest in Adelaide True Crime via Sean's work with The Advertiser. You can check him out at Sean Fuster on Facebook and Twitter. Until next week, we thank you so much for joining us, and we'll speak to you then. Sean, thank you very much once again.
Thanks, Daniel.
And we'll speak to you then.